Hello, good day. Welcome to everybody, from around the world. We have listeners from, of course, US, Canada, Poland, the UK, Liberia, Turkey, Australia, Uzbekistan. So welcome one and all. I just remind you that we are providing translation by our wonderful translator, Peter Wojciechowski. So if you will go to the globe on your screen, you can select English or Ukrainian. So, and then just remind everybody, we will be accepting, of course, questions at the end of the sessions. Welcome to everybody to another webinar in the Foundation, U.S. Ukraine's Foundation's continuing series of events dedicated to highlighting key milestones in Ukraine's path to independence. We can't hope to be comprehensive about the process. Instead, hope to focus on key moments, and especially that are not only important, but with our invited guests that can offer unique personal and historical perspectives. Preparing for this webinar, we were reminded of the enormous amount of time, effort, skills, professionalism brought to this process by many people that we could not include. However, from the Washington area, I want to thank a few people. Yuri Sayevich, Kaita Chumachenko, Yushchenko, Judge Bogdan Fute, Ivan Lozove, Oris Zichikowski, Markian Belinsky, Marta Chomyak, and the late Eugene Ivanciu. I trust I got at least most of the key people. And also a special thanks to George Mashuk, who has just completed on the Washington Group's website archival material of the various videos of our many speakers that came in those early years that have really wonderful resource. Many of you have heard me say time and again that I believe Ruch to have been the most strategic organization, certainly in my view, over these past 30 years. Listening to some of those presentations of those early years by Ivan Drach, Mikhailo Hodin, Volodymyr Yavuryushky, Maria Drach, has again confirmed for me the truth of that perspective of Ruch's strategic importance, a topic perhaps for another webinar. This year is one of celebration, the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. It really is in some ways miraculous because this was something that many generations could only hope for. It's a victory for the people of Ukraine and a vindication of our faith in Ukraine's future success. However, this is also a time of great stress. The fact that Russia is continued and determined to destroy Ukraine's independence. So even though there's a real pall to the current events, we want to take time to appreciate the significant victories of those early years and take inspiration from them. Last week, we had a 2-day session to talk about the current security concerns, and our Friends of Ukraine Network continue to work on this 24/7. Also, I hope that you will appreciate that even in times of great stress and war, there are some humorous moments that will bring perhaps a little chuckle to you. We begin this webinar with events in 1990 and will continue our discussion through December 25th, 1991, the date of Gorbachev's resignation and the recognition of the United States of an independent Ukraine. Although we are not able to discuss in great detail during this period, we mentioned that the second annual convention Ruch was held in September 1990, during which delegates voted to drop the phrase for perestroika or for Perabudava from the organization's name and fully endorse Ukraine's independence as the main goal of Ruch, no longer a reimagining of the USSR. Our speakers today include former Consul General for Ukraine, John Gunderson, the chair of Harvard University Studies Institute, Dr. Sahib Plochy, Former member of the central leadership and co-founder of Ruch, Serhii Odaric, Irena Yarosavich, former foreign media relations director of that program for Ruch, and our first speaker, Robert McConnell, then head of the external relations for the Ruch Support Committee, named Ukraine 2000, to begin talking about the disinformation campaign that really accelerated during this period to discredit the goal of Ukraine's independence. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia. Given how much we're trying to cover in this webinar, I'll see if I can make this something like a lightning round. In 1989, Ruch was formed. That fall, Vladimir Yavyusky came to Washington to speak to the Washington group. And in a dinner after that, he asked us for a couple of things. Congressional observers for the first contested elections for the Rada in March, and some type of a program to educate the Democrats, if you will, on the American system of government. Not that they wanted to adopt it, but they knew they'd never been told the truth. So he asked for those two things. Right here, I want to parenthetically note that ever since the time I met Nadia in college and learned about Ukraine, there were two givens anytime you saw a mention of the country in the press: the Ukraine and anti-Semitic fascists. Interesting, the little KGB colonel that's pretending to be an emperor now is still doing the same thing. But when Ruch was formed, the popular movement in September of '89, the Kremlin propaganda machine ratcheted up a couple of notches. Just two examples. Within a couple of days, both the New York Times and the Washington Post had feature stories, multiple page stories about Pamyat, the national movement in Russia. And in both of those stories, they emphasized that Pamyat was anti-Semitic, and they equated Ruch to Pamyat. Just a little background, it'll come back up here. Meanwhile, we went about trying to respond to Yavyusky and Ruch's request. We tried to arrange, and did arrange, a codel to go to the March elections. The Helsinki Commission chairman, Dennis DeConcini, sponsored it. We eventually had 14 members of Congress, and Helsinki Commission co-chairman Don Ritter was the lead of the 14. They were to go and fly to Kyiv and observe the elections. On Friday afternoon or Thursday afternoon before the elections, when they were supposed to take off, they had gone to Andrews Air Force Base. I knew they were leaving. I was at home. I got a call from Senator DeConcini. They're on their way back to the Rayburn building because as they loaded the plane, the Soviet Union announced they would be denied rights to enter into Soviet airspace. So that's how we were being treated at that point. I went on to Ukraine. Nadia was already there along with some other Ukrainian Americans. We had an extraordinary week. The elections were interesting, but what was more interesting in the long term was that we sat in numerous meetings with the Grand Council of Ruch, got to know them, got to see them, got to listen to them. We got to know some really interesting people. I mean, Ivan Drach, Mikhailo Horin, these men were extraordinary leaders, and there were other extraordinary people in those meetings. Listening to them talk about what they planned, how they planned to achieve it, was very inspirational and very interesting and informative. Because of the Kremlin's anti-Semitic push at that point about Ruch, I had asked if we could have a private meeting with Jewish leaders in Kyiv. And one afternoon, Nadia and I and Bodan Fouté to translate were taken to meet with 13 leaders of the Jewish community. When I explained what those paper articles had been, and I asked, so what can you say? I did not need a translator. We are Rook. We are Rook. Rook has a healthy soul. That meeting went on with them asking me to do things like go to synagogues in the Washington area and explain what they said and what Rook was doing. That was kind of an interesting experience when I got back. An Irish American Catholic going to one synagogue after another talking about Jews and how their lives were in Kiev. But it was very interesting all the way around.
Robert, if I might interrupt, you've got about 2 minutes if you want to cover.
The Committee to Support Ukraine was formed, 26 of them across the country. Their purpose was aid, materials, money, and so forth. There was a coordinating committee, and Ukraine 2000, the local one here in Washington, was in charge of government relations. And during those next months, we started submitting testimony after testimony to hearings where we took the opportunity of whatever the subject matter of the hearing was, when we could tie it to Rook, could tie it with what was going on in Ukraine and explain what was happening, build up the case for Ukraine, testimony after testimony. We also, every Friday, sent out a memo to all of the Rook committees. There were 26, but the mailing list was 86, including people in Canada, telling what had happened the previous week, what was going to happen the next week, giving copies of testimony, and sometimes asking for letters to be written. It was extraordinary, the kind of response. This file is just the letters to Congress when Stepan Kamara was arrested and then went on a hunger strike. The response from these people was extraordinary. Every Friday, those went out. Then in September of 1990, Mikhailo Horin came to Washington, and he was, all I can say, it was a watershed for the country. It was extraordinary. He had meetings. I mean, there's a list of the meetings he had. Nadia's not going to let me go through them all, but I will show. Secretary of Defense met with him for over an hour between two hearings, one in the House and one in the Senate, on the Gulf War. Desert Storm was gearing up, and he took all that time. You can see who all he met with. He was masterful. For somebody who had never been in this country, that somebody intuitively knowing how to talk and explain what Rook was, what their objectives were, and so forth. I wrote an article for the Ukrainian Weekly, a watershed for Ukraine. He was masterful. And I have notes of every one of those meetings. In January of 91, Horin was back. Rook wanted him to come back. And so at this meeting, this time he had fewer meetings, true, but I believe this is, no, well, anyway, he had fewer meetings, but he was meeting with people like Brzezinski, the editorial board of the Washington Post, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Magnificent, magnificent. So quickly, then in April, Nadia, hold on. In April, we were able to fulfill our other promise. We had a conference, a 2-week conference on the American system of governance, state government, local government in Indiana, and a week in Washington. The participants in that meeting there were 13 Rada members. It was really quite extraordinary. And there they are. Those are the ones that were here. I will only give one vignette about this meeting. They met with cabinet members, they met with Supreme Court, they met with senators, they met staffers, they met lots of people. But Lee Hamilton, at that time, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, was very much dead set against a breakup of the Soviet Union. Whatever his motivations, I mean, there were a lot of people like that, but he was a critical person. When he met with these 13 people and he asked them questions, and he found the responses from Ruk, the responses from Ivan Drach, Alexander Moros of the Communist Party to match, his staff told me that in that meeting, he made a 180-degree turn and was ready to support the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that takes you until April. Nadia. Bye.
Okay. So a wealth of information and important documents. I will say that we are going to be putting these on our website. We will build this where we will store the various documents that all of you have uncovered as you were getting ready for this webinar. So thank you, Robert. And as I said, we'll hold questions till the end. So as we move to early 1991, in particular, the March All-Soviet referendum, Professor Prochy, as a historian, will you please describe what was going on in Moscow and what was the why the referendum, what did Gorbachev hope to achieve, and then the situation within the Soviet leadership? And Serhiy Odarich, we're going to ask you to tell us more specifically what was happening in Ukraine and in Rukh surrounding the 91 referendum and why Ukraine put not one, but two questions. And finally, John, I'll ask you to respond how America was reacting to these events in March. So let's begin with Serhiy Plokhy, Professor Plokhy.
Thank you very much, Nadia. It's a great pleasure to join this panel, and for me as a historian to be on the same panel with actually the actors, the people who were there right in the center of the events, both in the US and in Ukraine. So it's a great pleasure and honor. Thank you. Going to the referendum for so-called renewed union, which was in March of 1991. The context for that referendum was really the turn towards the more conservative policies on the part of Mikhail Gorbachev. In December of 1990, the pro-democracy member of his team, Eduard Shevardnadze, who was the Minister of the Foreign Affairs, resigned and said that actually the coup was coming, that the dictatorship was coming. In January, what you see is the use by Gorbachev of military force to crush the independence of Lithuania and generally in Baltics. Again, Gorbachev went down in history, in the official history, as someone who refused to use force. Well, it was exactly January and February of 1991 when he didn't say no to the use of force. He denied his own involvement, but the force was used to crush independence in the Baltics. And then immediately after that comes the March referendum of 1991. And the idea was actually to save the Soviet Union, because that March referendum comes on the heels of the declaration of independence first by Lithuania in March of 1990, 1 year before that, and the so-called parade of sovereignties when not only other republics, but Russia itself, and then Ukraine as well, declared sovereignty, which meant the supremacy of the laws of the republic, individual republic, over the union ones. So the Soviet Union was falling apart in 1990, and in March of 1991, Gorbachev is trying to save it. Ukraine is one of the republics that under the leadership of, or under the communist leadership, takes part in the referendum and delivers approximately 70% of those who voted supported this reformed union. And that would become really a major challenge later in the year, in the fall of 1991, in preparation for the new referendum, whether it would be able to beat that number of 70% of Ukrainians, or those who participated in the elections, voting for for continuation of the union. So, but again, that was on the surface victory for Gorbachev. But what you see immediately after that, already in April, the union started to unravel again.
Sidhi, do you want to talk about what was going on in Ukraine and why there were the two questions placed on the ballot?
Yes, what was going on in Ukraine was that the Ruch, as was already stated.
Okay, we have two Sidhis.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Professor Blocky.
Good.
We're going to refer to Sidhi
Too many
Blocky as
Sidhis
Professor
around.
Blocky.
Okay, we're going to refer to you as Professor Blocky, and Sidhi, you're just going to be Sidhi. Sidhi, you please.
Ну, в Україні безумовно опозиція в вигляді в особі Народного Руху України і в особі Народної Ради. Це фракція, яка була в Верховній Раді, 124 депутати. Переважно, безумовно, це були члени руху, активісти руху. Намагалися прийняти, добитися рішення подібного до того, яке прийняли Балтійські країни, або прийняла Грузія, Вірменія, про взагалі непроведення на території республік загальносоюзного референдуму. Але це було нереально здійснити в Верховній Раді, не вистачало на це голосів, тому єдине, чого добилися, це провести разом з союзним референдумом всеукраїнське опитування з дещо іншим питанням. Тому в Україні відбувалося одночасно, по суті, два референдуми, а можна навіть сказати 2,5 референдуми. Принципова різниця між цими питаннями. В референдумі союзному звучало питання, чи виступаєте ви за збереження Союзу Радянських Соціалістичних Республік як оновленої федерації. Україна висунула своє питання, яке звучало принципово по-іншому. Чи повинна Україна бути в складі Союзу Радянських суверенних держав, а не соціалістичних республік, і саме головне, на засадах Декларації про державний суверенітет України. По суті, декларація передбачала всі атрибути держави, включно з армією, своєю валютою, верховенством своїх законів і таке інше. Тобто, по великому рахунку, українське питання, воно заперечувало загальносоюзне. І голоси розподілились таким чином, що за референдум Горбачова, за збереження Союзу як оновленої федерації проголосувало 70%, а за українське питання проголосувало 80%. Паралельно з цим ще відбувався третій референдум в 3 галицьких областях. Тобто 3 області на рівні обласних рад, Львівська, Івано-Франківська і Тернопільська, провели спільне засідання у Львові 3 обласних рад і прийняли рішення про проведення опитування на території цих областей, де звучало питання зовсім радикально. Чи вважаєте ви, що Україна повинна стати незалежною державою? І на території цих областей 88,3% проголосували за Україну як повністю незалежну державу. Безумовно, це були дуже такі напружені дні, тому що Верховна Рада прийняла рішення про опитування лише 27 лютого, а референдум відбувався 17 березня. Тобто у нас було буквально 16-17 днів на те, щоб провести агітаційну якусь кампанію, роз'яснення. І тоді навіть не можна сказати, що був якийсь центр управління. Тобто всі кинулися в бій, всі, хто могли, висували аргументи, підбирали якусь статистику, друкували листівки, хтось їх бачив, передруковував. Оце така була потужна хвиля, і в підсумку виходить, що Україна на референдумі більше голосів віддала за Україну, яка буде кудись, можливо, входити, але на засадах Декларації про державний суверенітет. Це була серйозна, велика перемога.
Irena, yes?
I just wanted to quickly summarize what he said in case Some people did not see the chat, which said, if you want to hear a translation in either Ukrainian or English, then you need to go to the globe to switch on the particular language you want to listen to at that moment. So for those who didn't switch on English, he said that in Ukraine, what was happening was, besides the regular all-Soviet Soviet referendum, there in fact was another question put, and that was whether or not Ukraine should I can't say the exact wording, but it sort of drift slightly from the all-Soviet, which is you want the recreation of the Soviet Union, and it actually put Ukraine's sovereignty as the first principle. And that one came through at more than 80%. Then in the Western Ukrainian oblasts, there was a third question put on the ballot that specifically asked about Ukraine's independence, and that particular vote came through at 88%. So in general, in Ukraine, even though the Soviet referendum came through at 70-something, nonetheless, there were two other questions placed that were not counted on the all-Soviet count, but in Ukraine, it gave a sense of what the public was also feeling and thinking. And it was to be separated more from Moscow than to be included in.
So thank you, Ina. So John, you arrived in Ukraine, I think, what, December of 1990. So you were really already put in place to sort of understand what was going on in Ukraine, but also, I guess, I don't want to say battling, but also the policy that was evolving from Washington, which may not have always been in sync with what was going on. I didn't want to.
Yes, thank you. First, thanks to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for reviving my happy memories of Ukraine in those very heady days. And I'm reminded as a Foreign Service officer, usually when you write cables overseas, there's some desk officer in Washington who reads it. We found our cables were read at the White House, the Defense Department, and State. So it was very nice to actually be listened to, even though we were often fighting with Embassy Moscow. So by way of background, I was appointed as Consul General. We had tried with the United States a number of times to set up a consulate. And for various reasons, including the invasion of Afghanistan and others, we could not do it. So my mandate when I was asked to become Consul General was to be the ears and eyes on the ground. But we also had a clear understanding at the time, coming in as somebody who was not Ukrainian American, I had a lot of background in the Soviet Union. I'd served in Moscow. I had a master's from Stanford in Soviet studies. And I had the typical thought, Moscow-centric, as almost everyone in Moscow, the Soviet Union would stay together. We're creating a new Soviet man. Nationalities were a minor issue. And I even once used the dreaded definite article when I started. So I learned quickly with the Ukrainian community not to do this. So when I went to Moscow, I became the nationalities officer, which was considered, I was relatively junior. This is 1979. And I started traveling the country and realized this is not just a small issue. There are major historical and other differences. So I started getting a sense, and I went to Kyiv at the time as a junior officer. I physically opened up that consulate and brought the furniture in, and then we stopped in 79 after the invasion. We did not do it, but that furniture was still there when I got there in 1990. So I'm arriving in Kyiv. One of the first assignment was to monitor the elections in March. Washington's initial view was that this all-union treaty was something that was good, because it was a reformed Soviet Union. You remember Bush and Gorbachev had met a number of times. Bush put great credence in personal relations. They were beginning to negotiate treaties, some of them very good, INF on nuclear weapons and others. So there was a sense that we wanted to deal with the center. We didn't want to deal with a lot of small entities. One of the big questions was nuclear weapons, that Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world when they became independent. And so Washington wanted to deal with one center. There was also underlying this, and we forget about this. This is Yugoslavia was beginning to fall apart, and ethnic cleansing and ethnic issues. And in Washington, they are thinking, we don't want another Yugoslavia. So the clear sense coming from the White House that we will want to work with the reformed Soviet Union. We were seeing at the consulate, looking at the 3 votes, that there's a lot other things happen. We talked to all the RUK people, Horin and Chernobyl and Drach, and we realized that what we were hearing from Embassy Moscow was not true. And we didn't have a political, position. We were reporting in facts on the ground. So after the all-union referendum, we were reporting on these other 2 things, and we monitored that. And they were bringing in by busloads factory workers to vote for the Union Treaty and not to vote for the other 2. So that was our first experience in election. I think Irina was there. John Stepanchuk, my deputy, who was a Ukrainian Russian speaker. So we started reporting after the Union Treaty that things are changing. Washington was worried about this. We can talk about at some point, if you'd like, Nadia or Bob, about the Chicken Kyiv speech. But
That's
I'll
next,
just
John. That's next.
okay. So that's basically where we were in March of 1991.
Thank you, John. You know, we were very fortunate to have you there with your experience, and particularly, I guess, on the whole nationalities issue, which of course really probably was a key issue of misunderstanding, say, in terms of the kind of policy we were developing on our side. You know, this feels like, and it is kind of a lightning rod approach to the various events. And maybe it is a reflection of how things were. Things were happening very quickly, a lot going on. And so here we are trying to capture this moment. So yes, Chicken Kyiv, as it's known. But of course, that was the visit of President Bush on August the 1st to Kyiv. Perhaps we can start with Robert, who can sort of set the stage of what he was monitoring in terms of the cables in Washington and his reaction and his informing of Ruch. Go ahead, Robert, take it away.
Okay, Nadia, well, first I'm going to insert one other thing because nationalities has come up. Ruch never, ever talked about Ukrainians. They always talked about the people of Ukraine. And that was because of the inclusive nature of Ruch, the inclusive nature of what they were trying to accomplish and who they had. All the entities were represented on the Grand Council of Ruch. And I remember Horin preaching that to me, so that everything we did in Washington, we talked about the people of Ukraine. In the lead up, even before Chicken Kyiv, I mean, the fact of the matter was the propaganda machine was, I think, convincing to a great degree American press and maybe some American officials that if the Soviet Union broke up, especially if Ukraine tried to become independent, there would be bloodshed. I mean, there were even references to nuclear chaos. It was a heavy propaganda machine underway. Now, Nadia mentioned my monitoring. While President Bush was in Moscow, I was monitoring the White House briefings. I was talking to some people at the White House, and through the course of that week, I was getting a pretty good idea of what I thought President Bush was going to say in Kyiv. And I have to say, I wasn't very happy about it. On the Friday before he was to be there on Monday, I wrote a speech rebutting what I thought he was going to say. It isn't a speech I would have ever given, but it was, you know, hammered it out, sent it to our person in Kiev, Ivan Lozove, and told him to translate it and give it to Ivan Drach. Just, you know, what was in there would kind of give him a clue what I thought was going on. Nadia, I think I'll leave it there and let John talk about Bush's arrival and going into the Rada and so forth. And then before Irene talks about the press conference, I'll talk about what that speech said.
Well, okay. Thank you for moderating. Okay, John. So yes, you were there. You saw the speech. I guess also, people don't appreciate necessarily really the challenges of just the environment. No cell phones, communications, right? You had to drive to meet people. Trying to Xerox a speech brought its own challenges. So please just tell us about that whole period.
You're on mute now.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to get between a married couple, so I will.
Oh, we've been doing that for 52 years.
Okay, good. So I'm in Kiev, and I was in Norway on getting married 1 week before, and was called back and I had to cut off my my honeymoon, but happily I was able to go and be part of history. So Bush comes to Moscow first. He meets with all the leaders, Gorbachev, and in Moscow at the time, here's something that we now know. There were those who were worried about the reform in the Soviet Union and about Gorbachev. And Khrushchev, who's a KGB guy, Yanayev, and I'll talk about him. He was the vice president and the guy who gave that infamous press conference. They're worried about what's happening. So Bush comes to Kiev. Yanayev is sent with Bush to sort of spy on him to see what he's doing with Kravchuk. They have a meeting. I will show you the meeting. This is very primitive, but this is if you can see, a picture of the meeting. That's Bush and Kravchuk. That's me and Matlock, the ambassador, and that's Yanayev next to Kravchuk. So they had a cordial get together, talked about general things, about the reform in Ukraine. Kravchuk is a very savvy politician, which sort of likes him, but he wants to talk to Kravchuk without Yanayev's presence. So I'm asked to talk to Yanayev because I spoke Russian, and Bush and Kravchuk meet. I don't know what they said then. I don't think anything unusual, but Yanayev then, I'm sure, goes back to Moscow and said, we don't know what's happening in Ukraine. And this might have been one of the triggering events. It's not written about, but that's my personal opinion.
You mean the triggering events for the coup?
For the coup.
Right.
Coup,
so
which
between
happened-
August 1st and August 19th, you think that Yanayev, having been August 1st on the meeting with Kravchuk and Bush, went back and say, hey guys, we don't know what's going on in Ukraine.
Right. I think that also when we went from Borispol, the airport, into Kiev, there were, I'd say, 500,000 people there. And they were cheering wildly. And Bush, I think it affected him. And Yanayev affected too. And there was somebody here told me this perhaps, there was a sign that said, we love, it was down with USSR. Bush thought it was down with USA and asked about it and was told, no, that's down with USSR. So those things are happening. Bush is factoring in. He still believes in Gorbachev, but he realizes a real independence movement there. So the speech is about to go out. I did not see the speech. I asked for it. I didn't, but they gave it to me 2 hours before to make Xerox copies. And I go to the consulate, by the way, which is 8 miles from the center, on the second floor of a Soviet slab apartment that we were living in. There's me and Stepanchuk, that was all at the time. Now we had a couple of others by that time. So we couldn't get in because the security guys had locked the apartment, unbeknownst to me. So I had to climb up the tree outside our window, which I knew well, to get into the Xerox machine, having to, use my good suit. So we made copies and I read the speech as I'm driving in. And I saw those two famous things saying suicidal nationalism and democracy does not mean independence. I mean, how can you say that? But that was in there. He gave the speech. It was the typical boilerplate. It wasn't bad, except those two were really just stood out. And there was, I think, reaction, and we talked about that afterwards. And I think some in the but they knew that it was a little discordant and didn't go well, but it didn't change the policy. They believed, and Bush believed, and Skokov believed that the breakup of the Soviet Union would be a bad thing, and we have to work with Gorbachev.
John, you did forewarn them a little, didn't you, though?
I did, and I said, I'm a diplomat. I didn't say you're crazy, and this is gonna. I said, and I talked with Ed Hewitt. You remember Ed Hewitt?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I was saying, this is a decent speech and it has all the right words, but those two things are neuralgic. And anyone who believes in Ukrainian independence, or at least moving in that direction, this is going to be bad. And he said, don't worry about it. We're handling it, and it reflects the president, not my thinking. So, what are you going to do? So I sat there and smiled and listened to the speech.
Okay. So it comes out the way I thought it was going to. Those two phrases stood out.
Mm-hmm.
What I had written and sent
Hold
to Dodge.
on, Robert, let me talk a little bit about the signs for a second, okay? Let me finish that. I want to respond to, so I want to respond what's going on in Ruch, in Serhi's office in particular, and John's comment about the signs. In Ruch, we had received a phone call from one of the Ukrainian American community leaders that said, hey, you guys, I know that Ruch's not super involved in this visit, but you know what, instead of having your typical signs that say, Moscow, heck, mostly kind of anti-Moscow negative things, we have some like nice signs that says, welcome President Bush, and, Ukraine and America, good friends forever, and things like that. So we said, okay, sure, no problem, except, there really was nobody at Ruch that could write signs in English except for me, and then visiting Tammy Gallo. So Tammy and I made up a few little poster signs that said, welcome President Bush, etc. And Serhiy Odadich and his team were actually making up these really huge signs in his brigade in another location. And he said, listen, write out a couple of slogans for me. Just print it out in Latin letters, because of course everybody wrote in Cyrillic then, and our guys will just literally imitate and rewrite the slogans as you print them. We're not going to be able to understand them. We're just going to draft over the letters on a bigger on poster board. And one of the most famous ones, and the one that was really loved by the international media, was the one that said, if being part of an empire was so great, why did America get out of one? That was one of the ones that was really popular. In any case, we came up with about 14 signs that Serhiy and his team, well, actually under leadership of Kononenko, actually printed up. So that's one of the things about behind the signs. Ruch actually made the decision we did a lot of the sign making, truly. And a lot of those signs that greeted Bush were actually developed by the Ruch sign making brigade. So I just wanted to put that in. Another really quick comment that I wanted to make was that when Bush gave the speech at the Verkhovna Rada, overall, it was well accepted. That is true, except for the Ruch leaders. Most of them did not stand up to applaud. Also, the entire White House press corps was traveling with Bush, and they also brought in their Moscow teams to do like local color stories. So the White House press corps was put up in the trade union building on Khreshchatyk. And the other teams, like the usual Moscow, CNN's Moscow bureau, was sent around the city to do local color stories. I went to the trade union building after that speech with the White House press corps. And what was happening there was Roman Popidyuk, who was then the press secretary of Bush, was literally, he understood and he got the sense that it was going over like a lead balloon and that there was problems in the making. And at that point in the trade union building, he was actually calling in key correspondents from major publications and major TV stations to sort of give them a debrief of how this speech was supposed to be interpreted. As the other as the Moscow crews were out there including attending the press conference that Ruch was having, picking up the local color stories.
All right, so Irena, Okay, I'm
That's
going
what
to
I
break
wanted
it.
to lead, hold on. So I want to lead into the press conference. Robert will talk about that. So there's two parallel events going on. There's the White House officials line going on at the trade union building, and Ruch was setting up a press conference as an alternative to the official line up in our usual writers union building. The speech that Drach was about to deliver, now Robert will explain what happened there.
Well, and I want to insert here, and I think John will agree with me. You know, when I was getting angry about what I thought he was going to say, the fact of the matter was, you know, in the State Department, there were different views. There were people that were very much supporting what was going on.
Right.
And I was hearing from them, but they were worried as well. Well, anyway, this speech that I wrote and never would have personally given, Drach went ahead and gave verbatim with one little ad at the beginning. And he said things like, and all this stuff got into the American press, listening to some of Bush's positions regarding captive nations, etc., in the past, now President Bush seems to have been hypnotized by Gorbachev. His ties to the center are strong. Even though the president took a very positive step of opening a consulate in Kyiv, the Bush administration still talks of stability in a way that suggests that our source of stability is Moscow. He has specifically refused meetings with Ruch leaders in Washington. I do find it ironic. Bush's Kyiv schedule involves him almost exclusively with officials of a system that has dehumanized the people of Ukraine. Those are just excerpts, but that's the tone of Ruch's reaction.
Can I jump in here? Can I jump in here?
Yes.
One to agree. There was a comment that Washington's thinking in the government was not monolithic, and that's true. I was getting feedback from some people at DOD and state that they disagreed with what the higher ups were saying. So there was that developing differences. Then about the post-mortem of this, and I think there was a realization that this did not go across well, and that they tried to make explanations that Bush was not referring to Ukraine, he was talking about the Caucasus. Well, why do you go to Kiev to talk about the Caucasus? And about the independence, he said, we should have said that democracy does not mean independence. We should have said democracy does not necessarily mean independence. So there was a lot of Washington dancing after that.
Yeah, and I want to confirm that because we had
Okay, Irena. So I think just to finish the story. So as I said, Robert never anticipated that it would be given word for word. And just as a postscript, when Drach was in Washington, somebody complimented him on that speech. And he said, well, don't thank me. And he pointed at Robert. Robert never thought he never thought he should admit to the fact that he was the author of it, but Drach didn't seem to have a problem. But I also think, Irena, you know, just to give a sense of really the circumstances you're working. So you are at the official press conference, right, organized by the White House, and you are inviting people, right?
Well, so yes, I got into the trade. Okay, remember, I do not have a White House press pass. I knew Popodyuk personally from my church in Washington. And I am sort of going in as the tail to the Ukrainian Weekly correspondent, Hussein Lopichak, who did get a temporary pass for the trade union building. I mean, these are obvious security concerns. So I get in, I kind of wave to Roman, kind of like, yeah, I am here. And he was busy he snarled at me and he was, okay, that's off the record, but he pulled some other people in for a conversation. Think of it this way. He is up there trying to explain what Bush really meant to say. We, Ruch, are up on the hill trying to explain what was really said and why we disagreed. The media has the official White House press corps, which is listening to Roman, and they're having their Moscow correspondents, their second B team, up the hill with us, hearing our version of the story. And then they get back together afterwards, and there's a clash. And this is where it comes back to Ruch. Do you guys understand that that there's this clash between what we heard in Kyiv, and I had been inviting as many people as possible to come up from the trade union building who didn't have a B team up the hill to come with us. And that's ultimately when it ended up happening. Not only was there kind of a clash within, let's say, the government circles, there was a clash within the media, because the B teams were getting the Ruch story and the A teams were in the trade union center getting Popaduk in the White House story. How they all resolved it in Moscow and on the flight back, I don't know. But
Okay, Irena, but you missed the part about you having to crawl around and give people little sheets of information, inviting them to the Ruch press conference.
Yeah, okay, well, that's kind of not, okay. So
Well, again, it's the
yes,
point of
well, one of the things to understand is that, once the entire Moscow press corps is in Kyiv, and once the White House press corps is in Kyiv, and we have no cell phones, and nobody has portable fax machines, and you can't call the press office in Moscow to tell them to come to the press conference because they're in Ukraine already. So how do you get a hold of these guys? So I went there to the trade union building. I had a little piece of paper giving out the address of where Ruch was holding its press conference and what time, and to please join us if you can. That's true. But I'd say we need to move on. I'm not going to cut myself.
Well, okay, Irena, no, we've got, according to the launch, we've got a minute. Let me just put my 2 cents on this. I have often said that that speech was a gift. Unintended consequences. If you I recall that, President Bush going to Kyiv was supposed to be what I call a drive-through visit, right? He was going to go, set some wreaths at various places and be off. Secretary Baker didn't think it was important. He flew off from Moscow to the Middle East, right? So it was supposed to be really a non-story, but it became a huge story. And more significantly, it was not just the Ukrainian Americans who reacted, but general, what I call non-hyphenated Americans reacted, whether it was Bill Sapphire. So it really put sort of Ukraine at the forefront of the discussions that happened. And but for President Bush's speech, that would not have happened. So I see it as a ultimate, positive thing. John, do you want to say anything? We have less than a minute for this section.
Well, I agree with you that the speech ultimately had the consequence of galvanizing independence feeling, and it crossed party lines. When we very quickly after that speech between then and the vote for independence, we had every sort of national security. We had Brzezinski, we had Kissinger, we had Nixon. I took Nixon to Ruch headquarters, and he sat there and listened to, Chernovil and Drash and Pavlichko argue about Jefferson democracy and Montesquieu and things like that. And Nixon sort of turned to me and he said, I like this, but goddamn intellectuals. That's what he said. But he liked that. And then he went to Kravchuk, and it's a little off topic. And Kravchuk was talking about independence and the failures of communism. And Nixon said, he's like Mayor Daley. He's a problem solver. So I have notes from Nixon, and it was fascinating to spend 48 hours with this very controversial figure, but interested. He spent all that time sitting 2 or 3 hours in the Ruch headquarters. So I gave him great credit.
Yeah. So that was, they say, a pivotal moment in so many ways. I also, one of the things that Robert did not cover, when Hoden came in September of '90, he had meetings with several cabinet members, including Secretary of Defense Cheney, who had a personal, opportunity to take measure of the people like who were running Ruch. At State Department, Baker did not avail himself of that, and I think that
I want to assert there. We had, you had already told me to hurry up, but among the meetings I tried to set up, we had numerous cabinet members and others, but tried to set up a meeting in the White House. Well, they did not want Horen coming in, an opposition leader from a republic. But Vice President Quayle said, I can't meet with him because, you know, it's frowned on by state and the West Wing. But what if you bring him in to meet with my staff? I'm going to take a speaking engagement out of town. So I went in with his national security people, Bill Crystal, his chief of staff, and so forth. And the other thing that Quayle did, which was just a little vignette, your next speech, your next meeting is at the American Enterprise Institute. I will have my limousine take Horen there. So while he couldn't officially meet with the president or the vice president, he got pretty good service there.
Okay, so moving on quickly, the coup, the week of the coup, and the vote for independence. Okay, we'll start with Serhiy Udarich, perhaps to talk about maybe we'll start with Professor Plochy to sort of talk about what was happening in Moscow and setting the stage, what was happening in Ukraine.
Yes, sure. That's the only moment where I can probably talk about that as an eyewitness, because I was during the first days of the coup in Moscow. And when I was in the train on the first day of the coup in the morning going into Moscow, and then the announcement came, there was silence in the small in the car, in the railway car where I was. So it looks like the old days just came. People that were talking about almost everything just stopped talking. And the impression was that, okay, it was all over. And then I get into Moscow and I see a very interesting picture that there are already leaflets from Yeltsin on the walls, and people are there and reading them and discussing them. And the police actually goes by and doesn't do anything to stop that. And another shock for me as someone coming from Ukraine to Moscow was really the popularity of Yeltsin. There was a column marching toward the White House, and the person at the head of the column was calling on people around, join us. There was a woman who was probably looking for food. There was shortages of everything with a bag, and said, what, for Gorbachev? And there was a silence on the part of that person who led the column, and then said, well, for Gorbachev as well. But it was very clear that those people were there not for Gorbachev. They were chanting Yeltsin, Yeltsin, Yeltsin. And that was, for me, was a sign that we were really in different places in terms of the political process, in terms of our leaders, in terms of our aspirations. So really, I, for the first time, came to Moscow as almost I came from a different country. But what happened there was, of course, something that the coup leaders who were tried to stop the signing of this agreement about the renewed, the reformed Union Treaty that they viewed as a collapse, as the end of the Soviet Union. They tried to stop that. They tried to save their own positions. What they didn't take into account, they didn't take into account the fact that Yeltsin would actually say no. They wanted to get him on their side, knowing how bad the relations between Yeltsin and Gorbachev were. They waited with arresting him until it was too late. So at the end, it was the Yeltsin and the people in Moscow who stopped the coup. But what happened next was that the first coup that was defeated was followed by a second coup that was now orchestrated by Yeltsin. And that was the taking over the Soviet Union, the key institutions, appointing his own people to head the KGB, to head the Ministry of Interior, to everybody else. So it was a Yeltsin's or Russian takeover of the Union. And that is very important element to keep in mind when you move to Kyiv and you see what is happening in Kyiv on August 24th. because the declaration of Ukrainian independence, and this is very rightly, is declaration of independence from the Soviet Union. But de facto on many levels, this is a declaration, of course, of independence from Russia. And this Yeltsin's coup and takeover of the institutions of the Union was a very important factor, in particular in communist majority in the parliament voting for independence.
John, can we now turn to you in terms of what you were, seeing or hearing from your colleagues in Moscow and how it was being interpreted?
Yes, I mean, everybody, I had been called back from Washington right before the coup. So I unfortunately was in Washington discussing, because they were talking about things are happening. They have intelligence, something might happen. So I went right back to Kiev when the coup occurred. And there was a sense, there was first a real fear that the old Stalinist Soviet Union was returning. I mean, now we just see it as a little blip in history. But when that first happened, with no actual precedent for this type of coup in the Soviet Union, there's a real worry. What a key event was that press conference that Yanayev had, where he announced that we were taking over and that, don't worry about it. But his hands were shaking like this, and he was drinking heavily. And it made it sort of a farce. And I think that was one of the events that we realized that this was not serious. There was this mass demonstration. Our embassy in Moscow was reporting on it. And there was a sense that these people, this is a clown show, some of these guys, would not succeed. But there was still a belief that Gorbachev was going to come back. We will work with them. So there was not an event that changed the thinking of Washington. That only changed post-coup and the fall leading up to the vote of independence on December 1st.
So now we move to what was going on with underground with Ruch. So Serhiy and Irena, again, you've talked about, you're listening to shortwave radios, trying to get the news, the news blackout. So Serhiy, let me turn it over to you now to talk about that whole week, and then really the strategic effort to get the vote for independence. Serhiy, please.
Ну, почну з того, що за кілька днів до путчу у мене народилася донька. І дружина сказала, що не повернеться додому з пологового будинку, якщо я не зроблю ремонт у хаті. І напередодні 18 серпня я до 3-ї ночі фарбував вікна, готувався приймати дружину з донькою. Тому виснажений ліг спати, і мене 19 числа вранці розбудив дзвінок батька дружини, мого тестя. І цей дзвінок розпочався із фрази: «Сергію, ти дома?» Кажу, ну так, я ж от розмовляю по телефону. Ну тоді у них нічого не вийде. Я такий сонний питаю тестя, у кого в них? Каже, ти не в курсі, там уже Лебедине озеро грає по телевізору. Тому буквально там за 15 хвилин я зібрався, вирушив в штаб-квартиру Руху, і по суті весь тиждень ми провели на ногах без сну, іноді спали просто по кілька годин, там по півгодини на столах, бо інших умов не було. Насправді виглядало це таким чином. Завдання наше номер 1 було інформувати громадськість про те, що насправді відбувається в Москві. Тому що головні події відбувалися в Москві, там був і сам ГКЧП, і там була основна протидія, як сказав мій колега Сергій, по суті, основною такою стримуючою силою проти путчистів виступав на той час Єльцин і його оточення. В моєму кабінеті я встановив факс, як зараз пам'ятаю Panasonic, і його перевага була те, що він дозволяв працювати в режимі гучномовця. Я зв'язався з Верховною Радою Російської Федерації і домовились про те, що вони не будуть класти слухавку, покладуть слухавку телефона біля їхнього внутрішнього гучномовців, їхнього внутрішнього радіо Верховної Ради Росії, по якому йшли постійні оперативні новини. Хто дав які накази, які війська куди пересуваються, на яких вулицях споруджені барикади і так далі, і так далі. Це постійно в онлайн-режимі радіо Верховної Ради Росії передавало, гучномовець у мене в кабінеті це все транслював, і постійно чергувалися дівчата, які записували основні події. Тут же ми їх друкували, найважливіші, і кожну годину друкували кілька сотень листівок, відвозили на Майдан Незалежності, де постійно перебувало кілька тисяч людей, іноді кілька десятків тисяч людей, і все це як гарячі пиріжки розліталося, і це була єдина можливість оперативно інформувати про те, як події розгортаються в Москві. Тому що радіо давало не все, не всі мали змогу слухати радіо. Ну, державне радіо взагалі нічого не передавало, крім офіційних повідомлень, тому це тільки якісь закордонні голоси могли якусь інформацію передати. Насправді тяжко було 2 доби. Як зараз пам'ятаю, що о 1 годині 30 хвилин ночі, 21 числа, стало зрозуміло, що заколот провалився. Тобто саме в цей момент частина військових відмовилась виконувати накази КЧП, і стало зрозуміло, що все, тепер все посипеться як картковий будинок. Питання тільки часу, скільки це займе, години чи може кілька днів. І я пам'ятаю, що лідери руху, ми провели зібрання вранці 21 серпня, вже забули про ГКЧП, вже воно нас не цікавило. Наше завдання було добитися позачергового засідання Верховної Ради України і, користуючись цією ситуацією, проголосити незалежність і заборонити діяльність комуністичної партії в Україні. І, по суті, от зранку 21 числа почалась робота. Парламентарі переважно засіли за підготовку документів і акту проголошення, і підготовки законів, постанов, проєктів постанов Верховної Ради. Я більше з своїми колегами займався підготовкою і запрошенням людей, тому що ми розуміли, якщо ми не зберемо сотні тисяч людей під парламент, нам не вдасться примусити, підтримати Народну Раду і примусити комуністів голосувати за проголошення незалежності і за, по суті, самоліквідацію. Тому я більше займався підготовкою саме вуличних протестів, вуличних мітингів і таке інше. І нам вдалося на ранок, так як ми і планували, на 24 число добитися засідання Верховної Ради і зібрати сотні тисяч людей під стіни Верховної Ради.
Sergey, you make it sound somewhat simple, but talk about strategic efforts, not only in terms of, like you say, to gather the people for the protest, but also the gathering or the parliament. Can you share some about how that was accomplished?
Ну, насправді депутати парламенту зібралися на сесію. Тут особливих великих зусиль не треба було докладати. А далі стояло інше завдання, яким чином їх втримати в залі засідань. Тому що, Ірена може про це краще розказати, як комуністи приймали рішення голосувати за незалежність. Вона тоді була в стінах парламенту, а я був на вулиці під стінами парламенту. То в один прекрасний момент до мене дійшло, що зараз просто комуністи залишать стіни парламенту, розбіжаться, зірвуть кворум і просто жодне рішення в подальшому не вдасться ухвалити.
Besides the vote for independence, they would disperse, correct?
Так. Щоб просто зірвати засідання і щоб зупинити засідання через відсутність кворуму. Тому Я перед тим понад рік працював секретарем Народної Ради, тобто я супроводжував всю діяльність парламентської опозиції, проводив багато часу в стінах парламенту, в комісіях, в комітетах, знав всі будівлі, всі підземні ходи, які сполучали парламент із будівлями Центрального комітету, Кабінету міністрів, приміщень комісій. Тому просто формував із мітингувальників такі пікети і їх розводив по тих під'їздах, де були виходи, про які ніхто не знав. Тобто всі люди, які стояли, вони дивилися на будівлю парламенту і думали, що оце от все. А насправді через 300-400 метрів були інші виходи, де можна було по підземних переходах перейти. Тому нам вдалося за буквально півгодини заблокувати всі виходи і не випустити жодного депутату, і вони змушені були повернутися до зали і голосувати. Я ще просив тоді жартома начальника поліції, заступника начальника поліції Києва, який проходив повз, побачив мій пікет, кажу, давайте допоможіть, дайте мені ще трошки поліцейських, бо не вистачить. Він каже, ні, ви і так гарно справляєтесь.
Sergio, no wonder we consider you the chief strategist, planning to block all the exits. Irena, do you want to now talk about some of the things that you were, again, eyewitness being inside, like I said, he said.
Well, thank you. I just want to do a quick little back up to the 19th. Said he was in Kyiv on the 19th, but like John Gunderson, I was not. I was actually in Zaporizhia, which was the end of the Червона Рута concert. And all the then presidential candidates, except for Kravchuk, had arrived there to give their stump speeches for the December 1st referendum, including Vyacheslav Chernovil. In the morning of the coup, which was the 19th, around 7:30, there was many people running through the hallways, sort of knocking on doors, like everybody wake up, coup in Moscow. John Stepanchuk and I went to Chernovil's room. Stepanchuk immediately, who was the deputy consul general, understood that he needed to get Chernovil out of Zaporizhia. And we met him, we went to his door, they opened and Chernovil greeted us, and I'll never forget his words. He looked at us, goes, good morning, my American friends. They're sending you back to the United States and they're sending me back to Siberia. That was the first sentence that I heard out of Chernovil on the morning of the coup. The second little coup story on the 19th was the bus trip back. We had sent a bus down from Rukh to pick up all the workers from Rukh who were working at the Червона Рута concert to return back on Monday the 19th. However, the reality of it was so people loaded up, were ready to go. The reality was there were many people who wanted to get back to Kyiv, many more than just the Rukh workers, and the bus was maximally loaded and people sitting on each other's laps, etc. The bus driver, theoretically, because I brought the bus down with the foreign correspondents who had stayed there, I was theoretically in charge of returning the bus, apparently news to me. And I got on the bus last, and the driver looks at me and he goes, okay, ready to go. Which road do you want to take? Do you want to take the highway, or do you want to take the roads, the side roads to the villages? I kind of looked at him. It's like, look, I'm the American girl here. You're asking me, you're the driver, how to get to Kyiv from Zaporizhia. I barely know where Zaporizhia is. So I kind of looked at him. I said, what do you think? He said very matter-of-factly, he said, well, if you take the highway, there's a higher chance that we're going to run into tanks. If you take the side roads to the villages, less chance that tanks are going to meet us on the roads. I remember looking at him like, you're kidding me, right? And he kind of looked at me, and I guess he figured out that he was dealing with this completely unknowledgeable, terrified American. And he goes, okay, ну ладно, беремо бічні вулиці. Okay, fine, we're going to take the side roads. And that's what he did. We drove through the side roads, and it ended up being sort of a 7-hour trip back. And I can thank Sergio Dadic, when we finally pulled up in front of Rukh, we were really worried. We had heard rumors. There was Swan Lake playing on the radio. He was getting rumors on the shortwave that he was listening to, that there were tanks going to be outside the city of Kyiv. So when we pulled into the city, we were kind of concerned what was going on at Rukh. And as he circled the plaza to go into the main entrance towards Ruch, we saw that all the doors were open, all the windows were open, bright lights were on. I mean, the place was just hopping. We got there about 8 o'clock at night. And I remember said he, Adadich, walking out to meet the bus, and his only words were, he goes, good to see you, lots of work to be done. So that was pretty much how my week started, and that was it. The rest of the week we just worked, and he's correct. By the 21st, we knew the coup was over, and there was the signature gathering was the main project. And on the 24th, when we got together, and this is where I'm going to ask in a minute for Professor Svi Plochy to speak. Inside the Verkhovna Rada, everybody was gathering. We saw the communists, they had received the Kazilka to appear the morning of the 24th. A lot of them were all at their dachas. Kyiv was pretty much empty, and they were kind of coming in train load by train load, and sort of straggling in the morning. And on the morning of the 24th, there were several, half a dozen different kinds of votes that were supposed to be taken. The main one, which was supposed to be the vote for independence. And there was no discussion of a referendum to be held on December 1st. There's just going to be a vote on August 24th. And that's the way the day started. We were going to vote for the referendum and declare Ukraine's independence, yes or no. And all of a sudden, there's a break. And all of us are told to scatter. And Plush, who was leading the discussion at the time, because Kravchuk was reporting about what he was doing during that week, said Narodna Rada, meaning the People's Council, all you deputies meet upstairs, and the communists, you go downstairs to your auditorium. So, okay, a couple of us journalists ran downstairs to the auditorium, thinking that was going to be a lot more interesting, and we kind of snuck in. And sure enough, that is where the decision was made to agree to have a referendum that will confirm the Declaration of Independence. Fine, there's a whole lot of detail there, but I said he was right. We were terribly worried that the communists would break forces, except that their lead guy, Horenko, got up and said, no, Tovarishi, today we are going to vote for independence, because if we don't vote for independence, nam bude bida. And with that, the communists broke, everybody went back upstairs. The journalists were asking me, going, why did you, all of a sudden, we, meaning Ruch, Narodna Rada, decide to hold this referendum on December 1st? It wasn't part of the plan. And at this point, I'm going to ask Serhiy Plochy to explain, because we were not ever told in Verkhovna Rada. So Serhiy, what do you know about the fact of why suddenly at the last minute, the vote for the referendum was added on the 1st of December, in addition to the presidential vote?
Yes, of course. One thing that certainly the referendum helped to do was to get the communist vote for independence. So the idea was that things can change and they can go home free and alive and so on and so forth. But there was another part of the story that involved communications between Kravchuk and Gorbachev on the one hand, and Kravchuk and Yeltsin on the other. And it looks like in the breaks between the meetings, Kravchuk kept calling Moscow and informing them on what was going on. And apparently Yeltsin didn't raise any questions, but Gorbachev's reaction was that, well, you can do whatever you want in Verkhovna Rada, in your parliament. It doesn't matter, because 70% of Ukrainians voted to stay in the Soviet Union, in the reformed union, and that your decision would mean really nothing. And again, at least according to Kravchuk's memoirs, that was also one of the contributing factors to come up with the idea of referendum and confirm the vote for independence on the referendum. Once Ukrainian parliament voted for independence, the majority of the republics that still stayed in the union actually declared their own independence also through the decisions of the parliament. But Ukraine was the only country that had, or only republic that had the referendum, and that was a key difference. Once Ukrainians voted for independence, the Soviet Union was gone.
Okay. So before we go to the build up to the December 1st referendum vote and the election, Robert, if you can take a minute to talk about We were in Vermont at a house that had no television, party line telephone. And so the coup happens and you get a message from Kyiv.
Well, yes, and there was an email at the time, the way we have it now. We were spending a fortune every month for the
Yes,
connection that we had with our
yes,
guy,
yes.
Ivan Lozeve, and we hadn't heard from him for a few days. We didn't know about the coup until then it broke. So I tap in to this party line and I get a message from Ivan that, among other things, tells me that when the coup broke, the command, I need to get the name, the commanding general of the Red Army in Ukraine had called Drach and asked him to a meeting, and he could bring somebody with him. Drach had gone to the meeting and then told Lozeve about the meeting. The meeting was to assure Rook that the military under his command in Ukraine had nothing to do with the coup, and that they had taken an ICBM out of a silo and laid it on its side, hoping that American satellites would see that and interpret it that there's a stand down in Ukraine. I took that, turned it around into a memo, and faxed it to Baker, National Security Advisor Colin Powell, and Dick Cheney. And within an hour, I got a call from Cheney wanting to discuss it and so forth. But I didn't ever heard from the other two. But, you know, interesting things. And I've never seen that reported anywhere. I do, Nadia, I will note, I mean, because I think it's important here, that Sandy Birchbaum, who is the head of the director of the Soviet Union Affairs Department at the State Department, you know, he said that from July on, a lot of the people in his group were, you know, wanted to get with the republics and so forth. And it took the coup to get the White House and the secretary to realize things are going to change.
Okay, we need to go back to lightning speed. The build up to the referendum vote. I think the Professor Blocky, can you talk about?
Oh, Nadia, I'm sorry. I know that no. In our Congress, as soon as the Declaration of Sovereignty took place, in the House, Don Ritter and Dennis Hertel introduced House Concurrent Resolution 212 calling for the president to recognize Ukraine with 90 co-sponsors. In the Senate, an identical one was introduced by DeConcini and D'Amato with 12. Nothing, no hearings, but that was Congress asking for recognition.
I'm going to need one of those books. Okay, so Professor Blocky, the formation of the vote, the wording for the referendum vote, you attribute the success of the referendum partly to the wording. Can you please share your thoughts about that?
Yes, this that is really closely related to the issue of the change in modern Ukraine in general. Of course, the word independence for the majority of the population after decades of the Soviet propaganda was about nationalism, almost suicidal nationalism, as it was said in the Chicken Kyiv speech. So the leaders of the Republic at that time, Kravchuk and people around him were not really sure whether they would get not just the majority of the referendum, but they needed more than 70% to beat the results of the referendum from March of 1991. So that was not clear. And my understanding is that a lot of polling was involved in the fall of 1991. And it is about around October that the realization came that probably there is a possibility of getting majority and getting over 70%. And that had a major impact on what Kravchuk and people around him were doing, in a sense that Kravchuk actually stops coming to Moscow. to these meetings that Gorbachev organized in Novoogarevo, now the headquarters of Putin, with the leaders of other republics. So Ukraine stopped coming there, and it was full go ahead for independence. Different formulations of the question for independence were tested. The results that came back suggested that more people would vote for the question, which would sound the way how it is sounded in the referendum bulletin, whether you support the decision of the Ukrainian parliament for the declaration of independence. So in that sense, those who were maybe wavering, the decision was support of your parliament, support of the authorities that were already there, and that certainly appealed to a more conservative part of the population. So that was again the part of the preparation for referendum. It seems to me, and maybe Serhiy Darich will correct me, there were 6 candidates running for the presidency, something around that. But the interesting thing that all of them, including very conservative communists like Tkachenko, the Minister of Agriculture before that, were running on the pro-independence platform.
So thank you for reminding us that it was not only a referendum vote, but also a vote for president. So Serhiy, you've succeeded on getting the Declaration of Independence through the parliament. And now you've got 3 months to get ready for the referendum vote.
Я в цей період більше уваги приділяв президентським виборам, оскільки я був керівником виборчої кампанії В'ячеслава Чорновола. Але все одно в кампанії всіх кандидатів, які йшли, обов'язково червоною ниткою все одно проходила незалежність України. В тому числі і кандидати, які були висунуті від демократичного крила, і Ігор Юхновський, і Левко Лук'яненко, і Леонід Табурянський, і Борис Гриньов. От, всі все одно робили акцент на тому, що можете обирати кого завгодно, але треба обирати незалежність України. Тому в цьому плані політична боротьба була якби не надто цікава, тому що всі кандидати хотіли в першу чергу одного – незалежності України. В Русі ключовим організатором кампанії за референдум виступав голова секретаріату Віктор Бурлаков. Були задіяні всі місцеві організації, друкувалися мільйонами різноманітні листівки. Дуже популярними темами була аргументація економічних показників, порівняння Радянського Союзу, України, тому що якби основну тезу, яку противники незалежності висловлювали, вона була така, що Україна економічно неспроможна, от без Росії, без Союзу, неспроможна вижити. І це була якби домінуюча тема, і на подолання цієї тези були спрямовані великі зусилля. Ми знаходили статистику і в металургії, і в космічній галузі, і в хімії, і чого тільки не знаходили. Було дуже багато емоцій, були просто тисячі різноманітних малюнків, плакатів, художники, те, що зараз ми бачимо часто в інтернеті, так звані фотожаби, чи як їх там називають. От. Тоді, звичайно, такої можливості не було, тому хтось щось малював десь на листку паперу, на листку ватмана, комусь іншому це подобалося, десь склали на ксерокси, десь перемальовували. І таким чином сотні тисяч людей були включені в цю кампанію. Не знаю, у мене особисто, я не пригадую жодної тривоги з приводу того, що Україна не підтримує незалежність. Питання якби було тільки в тому, це буде 80% чи 85% чи 95%. Наскільки вдасться добитися такого сильного результату. В підсумку, якщо не помиляюсь, 92 з чимось відсотки проголосували українців за незалежність.
So John, so this was another exciting but challenging time in terms of your, I guess, reporting as to what was going on in Ukraine. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? In terms of your sending information to Moscow embassy?
Yes.
Your predictions for the referendum.
Right. Well, we were reporting, obviously, and initially we started to get a sense, and we don't want to handicap it, but we said, I think our words are, it will get more votes than the Union Treaty back in March, meaning 70-something%. But the more we talked about it, the more we traveled, we realized it was going to be overwhelming. All the forces, obviously, RUK, the Communist Party, trade unions were all supporting independence. At the time, we were getting all these visits. We had Nun Lugar, we had the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. All of them were coming into Kyiv, and most of them, and it was fairly bipartisan, were coming to the view that Ukraine was going to be independent. The one thing that was being discussed in Washington was should there be conditionality, criteria for recognizing Ukraine if they voted for independence? And I just saw a note from Sandy Vershbow, who was the director of Soviet affairs at the time, and he reflects that there was not a monolithic view. There was a developing view in the Soviet desk that we needed to recognize, and this is reality. The president and Baker at the time had not come to that realization as far as I had seen. So we were then discussing whether there should be conditionality to recognizing Ukraine if they voted for independence. And that conditionality was 4 or 5 things: respect for territorial integrity, ability to govern, human rights, adherence to international obligations like START, for example, if Ukraine became independent, entrance into the non-proliferation treaty. So these are big issues. The view by this White House was we needed to have some conditionality. We were at a point of maximum leverage that we could leverage the Ukrainian government. Our evolving view at the consulate, although we probably should have pressed this more, is that you have more leverage if you recognize a vote of independence right away. And you can work with them on democratic development, on market economy, those type of issues. So that whole period there, and NATO had the same discussion about conditionality. And we in NATO, the US delegation was not in the forefront. The Canadians and others were pushing for that recognition right away, but we were talking about conditionality. And the Germans too, because the Germans were very concerned about the reunification of Germany and working with Gorbachev. So there was a dynamic there, and that period was not decided until actually well after December 1 that we would recognize them and establish diplomatic relations, which is different than recognition right away.
So Robert, very quickly, you have really a minute and a half. Talk about the meeting at the what? Yes, Irena.
I wanted to add to Serhiy Plokhy's earlier comment, just quickly. He is correct that there was really not, and also John Gunderson's, there's very little resistance in Ukraine to the actual vote for independence. It was coming from Moscow, and it was Russian disinformation. And in fact, Russian was sending out media teams in quite a large number to find out what was really going on, because the disconnect between what was being told in Moscow and what was happening in Ukraine was quite large. And one of those stories is one where the NBC producer called me and said, Yeltsin just had a press conference that if Ukraine declares independence, he's going to have a huge problem because he's going to have millions of ethnic Russians fleeing across the border from Ukraine back to Russia. And my comment to her was, if you can find me at least one fleeing Russian, I'll pay for your airfare and your entire team's hotel stay. That is how bad the Russian disinformation was,
Right.
coming out of Moscow.
Okay, so Robert, White House meeting the Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
And the Wednesday before the vote. The White House had a meeting with representatives of the community. I have one in front of you who was there from the administration and who was there from the community. The president was fair. He was pretty upbeat, but since I've been told to be short, he did say, if Ukraine votes for independence. What's the if? This is going to be overwhelming. But he said if it did, he wanted certain assurances. And he said that the assurances that he wanted was a commitment to the principles of the Organization for the Security and Cooperation of Europe. That has to do with borders, among other things. Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Charter of Paris, and nuclear non-proliferation. He then turned to Brent Scowcroft and said, is there anything else? And Scowcroft said no. Bush talked about his meetings with Kravchuk and that he's changing his spots and so on. That's a quote. And then at the end of the meeting, Terry Shmigala, who was kind of the representative moderator for the community,
And a personal friend of President Bush.
And a personal friend of President Bush, said that me, had gotten a message from Rook that morning, and I would like me to present it to the president. And that message was from Horn. The key points in that message were: the empire is dying. Gorbachev's effort to stop it failed, but he's seeking help from the West, and some countries are giving him assistance. Attempts to halt the empire's fall can have dramatic and even tragic consequences and provoke Gorbachev to adopt careless measures. Who will assume the responsibility for possible aggression by Gorbachev if he does that? On your position, Mr. President, on that position depends a great measure of our future road to freedom. It can be short and peaceful if you recognize Ukraine quickly as an independent state and lend it certain amount of assistance, or long and difficult if you were to support the dying empire, which has placed Ukraine on Ukraine's soil 1.5 million man army. After the meeting, Nadia, quickly, there was an after meeting with Hewitt in the old executive office building, and he was I got more to say, but he was asked, what about the rumors that the United States is urging other countries to slow down on recognizing Ukraine? He did not deny it. He said, we are trying to get people to coordinate and respond together.
Which of course is, I think, what John, you were saying, that was the policy as you enunciated what was happening. Okay, the referendum passes. President Kravchuk is elected. Then we're waiting, I guess, for a recognition. So
I have put the vote.
So Irena and Serhiy, what was next?
I'm sorry, Nadia. Okay, there you are. Okay, so very quickly, we're moving out of the lead up into the actual December 1st vote. As Serhiy was saying, for Ruch, really by December 1, it was getting clear that the referendum was going to pass. I will say, even though that we were doing surveys, there was, some people may have felt confident that it was going to be well over 80%, but not everybody did. One of them was Maria Drach, who was a few days before the referendum was concerned that, and kept referring back to what Serhiy Plokhy had mentioned. Everybody in Ukraine understood that we had to break the 73% barrier that was the all-union referendum passed in March. And so 75 was considered like the minimum. We had to get 75. After that, we were home free. All the press all the presidential candidates were having a press conference the final day before December 1st on the 29th. And Chernovil was the first one in the morning. And Les Teniuk came running up, who was working with Chernovil on his campaign, with a list of statistics. And it had on the statistics that Ukrainians were going to vote close to 88% for independence. And he wanted Chernovil to announce that at his press conference. And I, as the media person, looked at him and said, Tanyuk, you can say over 80%, but you cannot get out there and say up to 80%, 88% or more. That's absurd. No one's going to believe you, and Chernovil is going to look like a fool. Those were my final last words. Do not tell anybody that Ukraine is going to vote 88% because Chernovil is going to look like a fool. Well, I ended up looking like a fool, 3 days later when Ukraine voted over 90%. I think just the day of the January, said he will say, most of what happened on December 1st was election monitoring. And I'll let, if there's anything else that happened other than that, I don't know about it. From Ruch that he might be able to tell you.
Well, I think this is important because, again, given the time frame that you had to organize this, I think, City, if you give us a couple of minutes about really that effort to make sure that the elections were monitored.
Is Peter back translating, or do you want me to
We have
summarize?
somebody else. We have somebody else translating.
Okay, all right. I'm not sure that he understood.
Після 1 грудня дуже стрімко розвивалися події, передовсім у Верховній Раді. Ми намагалися максимально швидко, поки був цей емоційний підйом від результатів референдуму, максимально використати цей підйом для голосування основних законів, без яких незалежність України могла б лишатися просто декларативною. Пам'ятаю, що, мабуть, найскладніший з цих законів, він стосувався створення власних збройних сил, але от 6 грудня вдалося таки проголосувати і цей закон. І для нас було дуже важливо швидко, насправді не було ніяких конфліктів з Кравчуком, незважаючи на те, що у нас були суперечки під час президентської кампанії, незважаючи на деякі претензії щодо фальшування результатів виборів президента. Ми всі ці питання зняли, провели швидко інаугурацію Кравчука, і найважливішою такою от датою, я б сказав би так, останнім цвяхом в Радянський Союз, це стало 8 грудня, коли Кравчук з повноваженнями президента із десятками законів, які підтверджували незалежність і розвивали всі аспекти незалежної держави, поїхав в Білорусь, Біловіжську пущу, і там разом із Шушкевичем і Єльциним вони підписали акт, по суті, про припинення існування Радянського Союзу. Тому перший тиждень після референдуму був спрямований в першу чергу на те, максимально швидко ухвалити всі необхідні закони.
Because we've really run over time, why don't compress sort of the last two sort of sessions that we had set out so we can allow for some questions about, the referendum, post-referendum, and then the challenge of getting U.S. recognition of Ukraine's independence. John, do you want to go first and talk about that?
Sure. So after the vote, December 1st, we reported that back, and we actually were surprised too. So, we both underestimated, and we said it will be well above 75%. That was typical State Department, cover ourselves. So the question was, when would U.S. recognize Ukraine? And Canada had recognized it, Poland had, Hungary had, Iceland, a number of countries. The major European countries were withholding it. The Germans, because of their sensitivity working with Gorbachev, the French, because they were French and didn't want to be part of the crowd. And I think the Brits were somewhat in our situation, that there were those who were pushing for immediate recognition, those who opposed it. We, by the way, in Kyiv at the time, we had 4 or 5 NATO rep consul generals, Canada, UK, France, Germany. We met every week and to discuss it because we wanted to have somewhat of a consistent position coming out of Ukraine, reporting back to our capitals. And it was very useful to have the German there because he was saying things that we were saying about, this is the reality, Ukraine is going independent, let's be there early on. And I always thought that the US, because in so many ways had fought the Cold War, had been the major power, had supported dissidents in Wałęsa and Havel, that we should have gotten sort of the victory dance after the touchdown. And the longer we waited, then we were just somebody else joining in. And I think there was some of that thinking back in Washington, but the president and the Secretary of State, not the Secretary of Defense, were still reluctant to do anything that might jeopardize Gorbachev's position. Not basically until December 25th or 26th, that's the situation we had.
Professor Plocki, do you have any things you'd like to say about just what you knew about in terms of even reaction in Russia and overall about this period?
Yeltsin told Bush before the referendum that Russia would recognize independence of Ukraine, would be one of the first countries to do that. And Bush asked why. And the answer that he got was that without Ukraine, Russia would be outnumbered and outvoted by the Muslim republics in the possible union without Ukraine. And I still don't know whether that was real thinking in Kremlin, whether Yeltsin was trying to use the language that Bush would understand, but that was the argument that he repeated more than once. The key issue after the referendum was, of course, make, as Serhiy Adarich said, Ukrainian independence a reality, move beyond declaration. And from that point of view, the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the way how it was done, and again, Kravchuk was accompanied by 2 representatives of Ruch that were keeping an eye on him. So that was a smart move. Now we see that in the retrospect, because again, Ukraine turned the Commonwealth of Independent States into something that it wanted to be, that organization to be an instrument for civilized divorce. Russia, of course, looked at that very differently as the way to still keep control over the post-Soviet space. And despite the fact that officially the Soviet Union came to an end really on December 8th and then December 25th, whether some form of the Soviet Union would come back or not was the question that was on the agenda there in the 1990s. At the end, Ukraine never joined the organization it helped to create. It never formally joined the Commonwealth of Independent States. And again, that different interpretation of what the end of the Soviet Union means, whether that means true independence for countries like Ukraine, or that means being in the sphere of Russian influence, this is something that is not just debated anymore, but it's fought on the front lines in Ukraine today. So this is the story that has its origins back in December of 1991.
Yes. So as you so rightly point out, we're still there. So we go to the announcement of December. Yes.
2 things were going on in Washington. One was there was more pressure on the White House by Congress, constantly pushing for recognition, going along with what John said. But in addition, we were alerted by Ruch that among the things that Yeltsin was saying is that, yes, we'll recognize, but we need to discuss our borders. Because of that communication, there was a letter written on behalf of Ukraine 2000 and the coordinating committees that you signed to the President of the United States, raising that issue and saying the borders are set. Essentially, you want to be inconsistent with the Helsinki Commission. That had to do with borders. And your letter was then sent, I think I sent it to every member of Congress.
Okay. Even with 2 hours, we just covered highlights of these very fast-paced, important times. So let's now take a few questions. Irena, I think did you receive the questions?
Hold on, I'm so sorry, 1 second. While I'm looking for that, I just wanted to then to fill time, tell you that one of the interesting things that happened was as soon as the as the Krieplinga or the Independence was full court press. Hold on, I'm looking for a question. Okay, here, let me read the questions. Okay. From Luda Vusic. Okay, that's a comment, not a question. Washington, this is from Vershbau. Washington wasn't monolithic. When I was director of Soviet Union affairs in the State Department, we pushed beginning.
Okay, so John covered that.
Okay, we already covered that. So really, we have not received anything. Let's ask Katerina Yushchenko made a comment. There were.
Yeah, she read it, I think, John.
That's it. So I don't have anything else from Oksana since then. So let's, give everybody a second who is listening now to send a question through chat to us. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to do a quick little story about what Serge Schmemann from the New York Times did. After the CIS meeting on the 8th, Schmemann came to Kyiv, and he was the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, later on a major correspondent with the New York Times. And he asked to interview several people, among them Chomneville. And we went to the interview, and Chomneville was quite bitter at the time. And he said that Kravchuk's government would not last for more than 2 years. Okay, well, gee whiz, we just, he just got elected, he just got sworn in, and we just voted for independence. And here's Chomneville already making this kind of statement for the record. So we get into the cab with Schmemann, and as a foreign media person, as a media person, you're not supposed to tell journalists what to write, but I'm thinking that, okay, I'm about to be super unprofessional. And I sat in the back with the cab and I said, look, Serge, honestly, just if you don't have to quote Chomneville saying that, really, let's not. It's not the most important thing. He's a little bit upset, etc. And Schmemann said, he goes, listen, I understand. He goes, that's not the main part of the story. And then he looked at me flat out. He goes, do you know why Ukraine is going to succeed? I'm like, okay, what's your opinion? He goes, Ukraine is going to succeed because it has so many people who care about it. Russia doesn't have that. That was the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times telling me that in the back of the cab. And I think that is sort of the bottom line. Now,
And I think it's true to today. A lot of people care about Ukraine, not just what I call non-hyphenated Americans and others. Okay, so maybe some final words from everybody.
We have 2 questions. I'm just going to read them out for anybody who wants to read them. One was the question, what were the role of the Ukrainian churches in any of this process, and how did the churches respond? And the second question is, what was Donbass thinking during this time, and then what went wrong over time there? So who wants to, maybe Serhiy Plokhy, do you have any comments about what was going on in terms of the churches and their involvement? And then whoever wants to take Donbass.
Well, I think that Professor can do probably both.
Okay. Well, on the churches, extremely important factor in the mobilization toward independence was the mobilization or legalization of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. So 2 things that were kind of a sort of tolerated by the authorities by the late of 1980s. The first one was ecology around Chernobyl. So those rallies would be tolerated. And the second one, given the change of the policy toward the Russian Orthodox Church, Gorbachev really had to go for the recognition of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. But before that, the largest rallies in Ukraine were around Chernobyl and about Greek Catholic Church. And out of the rallies around Chernobyl, Ruch was born. So that's on the churches. So really, you can't remove that story and story mobilization around the Greek Catholic Church from that equation. And then the autocephalous Orthodox Church, of course, followed. And in terms of Donbass, Donbass voted overwhelmingly for independence. And what they expected from independence, yes, thank you, it's what, 82, 83%. What they expected was really the fact that they will be somehow helped and saved from a very difficult economic situations in which they were, partially because they are the rust belt of the Soviet Union, the dated technologies of the late 19th century, the global story in general. And that wasn't really cured by independence. So what you saw later was the satisfaction now with independence, because the key issues of the economic well-being, of the change of the infrastructure and things like that were not addressed. And so the story of the Donbass, it's like a person with a toothache that is there running from one doctor to another, trying to be saved. And the solution, of course, is a really dramatic change of the economic infrastructure that, of course, didn't happen.
In listening to speeches by both Darach and Horin, I think they mentioned the fact that they had received a delegation of miners who came to Ruch, and even though, I mean, Russian speaking, but supporting Ukraine's independence. So I don't know, maybe Sidhi or Irena, maybe you were part of that or heard of that. But also there were the mining strikes, right? Which were, like you say, they were protesting and voting, like I say, for a better future, not necessarily the traditional maybe meaning of right of independence. Irena, Sidhi, do you have anything that might?
John wants to say something.
Yeah, if I could just comment on the churches. We probably, I mean, John Stefanchuk, and many of us know him, and I asked him to do a cable on the churches, the Catholic and the autocephalous and Orthodox, and difference between the Russian and the Ukrainian. And John's eyes lit up, and he writes this 20-page treatise. That should be a PhD thesis. And I said, "This is great, John. You're going to put people asleep back in Washington," you know, and it was a great cable, but I said, "Put it in one page and talk about the political issues involved in that," which he did. So that was my sort of John Stefanchuk churches. Now in the Donbass, one of the things we tried to do is there was a lot, I think, a preconception that you have the Russian part of Ukraine, you have the Ukrainian part of Ukraine, and they were different. And we try to get across the idea in the Donbass, there's a lot of intermarriage. They don't think of themselves as Russian or Ukrainian. They're just there and they're speaking different languages. And if we start to think of these separate unity as separate parts, we are not understanding the development of Ukraine and the politics of Ukraine.
Thank you, John, for that. Well, I think we are just about at the end of time. So talking about the churches, Irena and I met in 1987 when we worked on the commemoration of the millennium of Kyiv and Rus. And so I think that's another webinar that we believe is important, because there was significant things that impacted, like you say, so much on civil society and also the road to independence. I think in the previous webinar, Sidhi, you described the situation as being a volcano where you had these different entities that were unhappy with the circumstances, whether it's the miners, the mothers of Chernobyl, veteran soldiers, you know, they all sort of came together at the same time. And Ruch was the strategic entity that brought all of these things together. So it's 2:00. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. Even though I've had many discussions with all of you, this still was of great interest. Thank you all.
Thank
До
you.
побачення.
Thank
До
you.
побачення.
Good seeing everybody.
До
Bye-bye. Till next time.